Continuing on page 352. They were in a big hurry to produce a criminal code in time for the trial of the socialist revolutionaries. The time had come to set in place the granite foundation stones of the law. On May 12th, as had been agreed, the session of the VTIK convened, but the projected code had not yet been completed. It had only just been delivered for analysis to Vladimir Lenin at his Gorky estate outside Moscow. 6 articles of the code provided for execution by shooting as the maximum punishment. This was unsatisfactory. On May 15th, on the margins of the draft code, Lenin added 6 more articles requiring execution by shooting, including, under Article 69, propaganda and agitation, particularly in the form of an appeal for passive resistance to the government and mass rejection of the obligation of military service or tax payments. And one other crime that called for execution by shooting, unauthorized return from abroad. My, how the socialists all used to bob back and forth incessantly, and there was one punishment that was equivalent of execution by shooting, exile abroad. Vladimir Ilyich foresaw a time not far distant when there would be a constant rush of people to the Soviet Union from Europe, and it would be impossible to get anyone voluntarily to leave the Soviet Union for the West. Lenin went on to express his principal conclusion to the People's Commissar of Justice. Comrade Kursky, in my opinion, we ought to extend the use of execution by shooting, allowing the substitution of exile abroad, to all activities of the Mensheviks, the socialist revolutionaries, etc. We ought to find a formulation that would connect these activities with the international bourgeoisie. That's Lenin's italics. To extend the use of execution by shooting, nothing left for the imagination there. And did they exile very many? Terror is a method of persuasion. This too could hardly be misunderstood. But Kursky nonetheless still didn't get the whole idea. In all probability, what he couldn't quite work out was a way to formulate that formulation, a way of working in that very matter of connection. The next day he called on the chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, Lenin, for clarification. We have no way of knowing what took place during their conversation, but following it up on May 17th, Lenin sent a letter from Gorky. Comrade Kursky, as a sequel to our conversation, I am sending you an outline of a supplementary paragraph for the criminal code. The basic concept, I hope, is clear, notwithstanding all the shortcomings of the rough draft. Openly set forth a statute which is both principled and politically truthful, not just judicially narrow, to supply the motivation for the essence and the justification of terror, its necessity, its limits. The court must not exclude terror. It would be self-deception or deceit to promise this, and in order to provide it with a foundation and to legalize it in a principled way, clearly and without hypocrisy and without embellishment, it is necessary to formulate it as broadly as possible. For the revolutionary righteousness and a revolutionary conscience will provide the details for applying it more or less broadly in practice. With communist greetings, signed Lenin. We will not undertake, end quote, we will not undertake to comment on this important document. What it calls for is silence and reflection. The document is especially important because it was one of Lenin's last directives on this earth. He had not yet fallen ill, and an important part of his political testament. 10 days after the letter, he suffered his first stroke, from which he recovered only incompletely and temporarily in the autumn months of 1922. Perhaps both letters to Kursky were written in that light, an airy white marble boudoir study at the corner of the second floor where the future deathbed of the leader already stood waiting. Attached to this letter is a rough draft mentioned in it, containing two versions of the supplementary paragraph, out of which would grow in a few years' time both Article 58.4 and all of our dear little old mother, Article 58. You read it and you are carried away with it admiration. That is what it really means to formulate it as broadly as possible. That's what is meant by extending its use. You read and you recollect how broad was the embrace of that dear little old mother. Propaganda or agitation or participation in an organization or assistance, objectively assisting or being capable of assistance or assisting organizations or persons whose activity has the character, unquote. Hand me St. Augustine and in a trice I can find room in that article for him too. Everything was inserted as required. It was retyped, execution by shooting was extended, and the session of the All-Russian Central Committee, Executive Committee, adopted a new criminal code shortly after May 20th and decreed it to be in effect from June 1st, 1922 on. And so began, on the most legal basis, the 2-month-long Trial J, Trial of the Socialist Revolutionaries, June 8th to August 7th, 1922. The court was the supreme tribunal of the Vectri. The usual presiding judge, Comrade Karklin, a good name for a judge derived from the word meaning to croak or caw, was replaced for this important trial, which was being watched closely by the entire socialist world, by the resourceful Georgy Pyatakov. Provident fate enjoys its little jokes, but it also leaves us time to think things over. It left Pyatakov 15 years. There were no defense lawyers. The defendants, all leading socialist revolutionaries, undertook their own defense. Pyatakov bore himself harshly and interfered with the defendants having their say. If my readers and I are not already sufficiently informed to know that what was important in every detail was not the charges brought, nor the guilt, so-called, but the expediency, we would perhaps not be prepared to accept this trial wholeheartedly. But expediency works without fail. The SRs, as opposed to the Mensheviks, were considered still dangerous, not yet dispersed and broken up, not yet finished off, and on behalf of the fortress of a newly created dictatorship, proletariat, it was expedient to finish them off. Someone unfamiliar with this principle might mistakenly view the entire trial as an act of party vengeance. Involuntarily, one ponders the charges set forth in this trial, placing them in the perspective of the long drawn-out and still unfolding history of nations, which the exception of a very limited number of parliamentary democracies during a very limited number of decades, the history of nations is entirely a history of revolutions and seizures of power. And whoever succeeds in making a more successful and more enduring revolution is from that moment on graced with the bright robes of justice. And his every past and future step is legalized and memorialized in oaths, whereas every past and future step of its unsuccessful enemies is criminal and subject to arraignment and a legal penalty. The criminal code had been adopted only 1 week earlier, but 5 whole years of post-revolutionary experience had been compressed into it. 20, 10, and 5 years earlier, the SRs had been the party next door in the effort to overthrow Tsarism, a party which had chiefly taken upon itself, thanks to the particular character of its terrorist tactics, note, a burden of hard labor imprisonment which had scarcely touched the Bolsheviks. Now the first charge against them was that the SRs had initiated the Civil War. Yes, they had begun it. They were accused of armed resistance to the October seizure of power when the provisional government, which they supported and which was in part made up of their members, was lawfully swept out of office by the machine gun fire of the sailors. The SRs tried altogether illegally to defend it, and even returned shot for shot, and even called into battle the military cadets of that deposed government. The Gulag. Defeated in battle, they did not repent politically. They did not get down on their knees to the Council of People's Commissars, which had declared itself to be the government. They continued to insist stubbornly that the only legal government was the one which had been overthrown. They refused to admit right away that what had been their political line for 20 years was a failure, and they did not ask to be pardoned, nor to have their party dissolved and ceased to be considered a party. The second charge against them was that they had deepened the abyss of the Civil War by taking part in demonstrations. By this token, rebellions on January 5th and 6th, 1918, against the lawful authority of the workers' and peasants' government. They were supporting their illegal constituent assembly, elected by universal, free, equal, secret, and direct voting, against the sailors and the Red Guards, who legally dispersed both the assembly and the demonstrators. And what good could have come of peaceable sessions in the Constituent Assembly? Only the conflagration of a 3-long civil war, and that is why the Civil War began. But not all people submitted simultaneously and obediently to the lawful decrees of the Council of the People's Commissars. The third charge was that they had not recognized the peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk, that awful life-saving peace of Brest-Litovsk, which had cut off not Russia's head, but only parts of its torso. By this token, declared the official indictment, there were present, quote, all the signs of high treason and criminal activity directed to drawing this country into war, unquote. High treason, that is another club with 2 ends. It all depends on which end you have hold of. From this followed the serious fourth change. In the summer and fall of 1918, those final months and weeks when the Kaiser's Germany was scarcely managing to hold its own against the Allies and the Soviet government, faithful to the Brest Treaty, was supporting Germany in its difficult struggle with trainloads of foodstuffs and a monthly tribute of gold. The SRs traitorously prepared, well, they didn't actually prepare anything, but it was their custom. Did more talking about it than anything. But what if they really had to blow up the railroad tracks in front of one such train, thus keeping the gold in the motherland? In other words, they, quote, prepared criminal destruction of our public wealth and the railroads, unquote. At the time the communists were not yet ashamed of, and did not conceal the fact that, yes, indeed, Russian gold had been shipped off to Hitler's future empire, and it didn't seem to dawn on Krylenko, despite his study in 2 academic departments, history and law, nor did any of its existence whisper the notion to him that if steel rails are public wealth, then maybe gold ingots are too. From this 4th challenge, a 5th followed inexorably. The SRs had intended to produce the technical equipment for such an explosion with money received from Allied representatives. They had wanted to take money from the Entente in order not to give gold away to Kaiser Wilhelm. And this was the extreme horror of treason. Just in case Krylenko did mutter something about the SRs having connections with Ludendorff's general staff, but this stone had indeed landed in the wrong vegetable garden, and he quickly dropped the whole thing. From this it was only a very short step to the 6th charge, that the SRs had been Entente spies in 1918. Yesterday they had been revolutionaries, and today they were spies. At the time, this accusation probably sounded explosive, but since then, and after many, many trials, the whole thing makes one want to vomit. Well then, the 7th and 10th points concerned collaboration with Savinkov or Filinenko or the cadets or the Union of Rebirth, had it ever really existed, and even with aristocratic reactionary dilettante, so-called white lining students, or even the White Guards. The series of linked charges was well expounded by the prosecutor as a result of either hard thinking in his office or a sudden stroke of genius on the rostrum. He managed in his trial to come up with that tone of heartfelt sympathy and friendly criticism which he would make use of in subsequent trials, with increasing self-assurance and in ever heavier doses, and which in 1937 would result in dazzling success, which almost created a common ground against the rest of the world between those doing the judging and those who were being judged, and it played on the defendant's particular soft spot. From the prosecutor's rostrum, they said to the SRs, quote, "After all, you and we are revolutionaries. We, you and we, that adds up to us. And how could you have fallen so low as to join the cadets? Yes, no doubt your heart is breaking." Or with the officers, quote, "or with the officers, or to teach the aristocratic, reactionary, dilettante students your brilliantly worked out scheme of conspiratorial operation," unquote. None of the defendants' replies is available to us. Did any of them point out the particular characteristic of the October coup? Had been to declare war immediately on all the other parties and forbid them to join forces. They're not hauling you in, so don't you dare peep. But for some reason, one gets the feeling that some of the defendants sat there with downcast eyes, and that some of them truly had divided hearts. Just how could they have fallen so low? After all, for the prisoner who'd been brought in from a dark cell, the friendly, sympathetic attitude of the prosecutor in the big bright hall struck home very effectively, and Krylenko discovered another very logical little path which was to prove very useful to Wyszynski when he applied it against Kamenov and Bukharin. On entering into an alliance with the bourgeoisie, you accepted money from them. At first you took it for the cause, only for the cause, and with no wise for party purposes. But where is the boundary line? Who can draw that dividing line? After all, isn't it the cause a party cause also? And so you sank to the level, you, a socialist revolutionary party, of being supported by the bourgeoisie. Where was your revolutionary pride? A full quota of charges, and then some, had been piled up, and the tribunal could have gone out to confer and thereupon nailed each of the prisoners with his well-merited execution. But alas, there was a big mix-up. A. Everything the Socialist Revolutionary Party had been accused of related to 1918. B. Since then, February 27, 1919, an amnesty had been declared for SRs exclusively, which pardoned all of their past belligerency against the Bolsheviks on the sole stipulation that they would not continue the struggle into the future. C. And they had not committed the struggle since that time. And D. It was now 1922. How could Krylenko get around that one? Some thought he had been given to this point when the Socialist International asked the Soviet government to drop charges and not put its socialist brothers on trial. Some thought had been given to it. In fact, at the beginning of 1919, in the face of threats from Kolchak and Denikin, the SRs had renounced their task of revolt against the Bolsheviks and had abandoned all armed struggle against them. And to aid their communist brethren, the Samara SRs have even opened up a section of the Kolchak front, which was in fact why the amnesty had been granted. And right at the trial, the defendant gentleman, a member of the Central Committee, said, quote, "Give us a chance to make use of the whole gamut of so-called liberal, so-called civil liberties, and we will not break the law," unquote. Give it to them, the whole gamut, to boot. What loudmouths. And it was just that they weren't engaged in any opposition. They had recognized the Soviet government. In other words, they had renounced their former provisional government, yes, and the Constituent Assembly as well. And all they asked was a new election for the Soviets, with freedom for all parties to engage in electoral campaigning. Now, how did you hear that? Did you hear that? That's where the hostile bourgeois beast poked its snout through. How could we? After all, this is a time of crisis. After all, we are encircled by the enemy, and in 20 years' time, in 50 years' time, and 100 years' time for that matter, it will be exactly the same. And you want freedom for the parties to engage in electoral campaigning? You bastards. Politically sober people like Krylenko could only laugh and reply and shrug their shoulders. It had been a just decision immediately by all measures of state suppression to prevent these groups from conducting propaganda against the government, and specifically in reply to the renunciation by the SRs of armed opposition and to their peaceful protests. They had put the entire Central Committee of the Socialist Revolutionary Party in prison. As many of them as they could catch, that's how we do it. But to keep them in prison, hadn't it already been 3 years? Wasn't it necessary to try them? And what should they be charged with? This period had not sufficiently investigated the pre-trial examination, our prosecutor complained. But in the meanwhile, one charge was correct, in that the same February 1919, the SR had passed a resolution which they had not put into effect, thought in terms of a new criminal code that didn't matter at all, to carry on secret agitation in the ranks of the Red Army in order to induce the soldiers to refuse to participate in reprisals against the peasants. And that was a low-down, foul betrayal of the revolution, to try and persuade men not to take part in reprisals. And they could also be charged with everything that the so-called foreign delegation of the Central Committee of the SRs, those prominent SRs who had fled to Europe, had said or written in and done mostly in words. But all that wasn't enough, so here's what they brought up. Many defendants sitting here would not deserve to be indicted in the given case, were it not for the charge of having planned terrorist attacks. Allegedly, when the amnesty of 1919 had been published, none of the leaders of Soviet justice had imagined that the SRs had also planned to use terrorism against the leaders of the Soviet state. Well, indeed, who could possibly have imagined that, the SRs and terrorism, all of a sudden? And if it had come to mind, it would have been necessary to include it in the amnesty too, or else not accept the gap in the Kolchak front. It was really very, very unfortunate indeed that no one had thought of it, not until it was needed. Then someone thought of it, so this charge had not been amnestied, for after all, struggle was the only offense that had been amnestied. And so Krylenko could now make the charge. And in all likelihood, they had discovered so very much. In the first place, they had discovered that the SR leaders had said, back in the first days of the October seizure of power, Ch.9 at the Fourth Congress of the SRs had said that the party would counterpose all its forces against any attack of the rights of the people as it had under Tsarism, and everyone remembered how it had done that. Bucks had said, if the autocrats at Smolny also infringe on the Constituent Assembly, the Socialist Revolutionary Party will remember its old tried and true tactic. Perhaps it did remember, but it didn't make up its mind yet to act. Yet, apparently, it could be tried for it anyway. In this area of our investigation, Krylenko complained because of conspiracy, quote, there will be a little testimony from witnesses. This has made my task extremely difficult in this area, terrorism. It is necessary at certain moments to wander about in the shadows, unquote. What made Krylenko's task so difficult was the fact that the use of terrorism against the Soviet government was discussed at the meeting of the SR Central Committee in 1918 and rejected, and now, years later, it was necessary to prove that the SRs had been engaged in self-deception. The SRs had said at the time that they would not resort to terrorism until and unless the Bolsheviks began to execute socialists. Or, in 1920, they had said that if the Bolsheviks were up to threaten lives of SR hostages, then the party would take up arms. So the question then was, why did they qualify their renunciation of terrorism? Why wasn't it absolute? And how had they even dared to think about taking up arms? Why were there no statements equivalent to absolute renunciation? But Comrade Krylenko, maybe terrorism was their second nature. The SR party came out, no terrorist acts whatsoever. And this was clear even from Krylenko's summing up of the charges. But the prosecution kept stretching facts such as these. One of the defendants had in mind a plan for blowing up the locomotive of a train carrying the Council of People's Commissars to Moscow. That meant the Central Committee of the SRs was guilty of terrorism. And the terrorist Ivanova had spent one night near the railroad station with one charge of explosives, which meant There had been an attempt to blow up Trotsky's train, and therefore the SR Central Committee was guilty of terrorism. And further, Donskoy, a member of the Central Committee, warned Sonia Kaplan that she would be expelled from the party if she fired at Lenin. But that wasn't enough. Why hadn't she been categorically forbidden to? Or perhaps, why hadn't she been denounced to the Cheka? I'll take a break there. Sorry, my reading is bad today. I can't talk. Sorry. Bye.